welcome to our podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
I love it. Thanks, Emma. It's good to see you.
And you too. We know each other quite well, but our audience might not have met you and might not know your work. So I would like to start with using Esther's card game. Where do we begin? To ask you a brief question, which will just treat as a bit of an icebreaker. So I'll ask you the question, and that narrative will be a bit of a bridged connection for our audience that are kind of listening or watching you speak for the first time. So on the card, tell me about a time you didn't ask for what you needed. So tell me about a time that you didn't ask for what you needed.
When my kids are still, 9 and 12, and they're both sick, and then I come down with it, and my husband's well, and I'm still taking care of the kids and taking care of myself. So I would say that is a time, a couple weeks ago where I wasn't able to say, hey, I don't have the bandwidth right now. Like, you need to do, even though it's uncomfortable for you, you need to do those things with the kids. And I need you to place an order to get some food for me. So I think that's something that I am constantly evolving with my self-care, is how, when I've reached my limit, or how do I do it? How do I know before I've reached my limit and then ask for help?
Oh, that's so insightful. I'm sure lots of our listeners can relate, but I can definitely relate to that. Something that helped me was, have you done the Brené Brown has this thing where with your partner, it's like, oh, I've got 8 today. And you might say, that's great, because I've only got 5. So together we've got more than. But if I showed up and went, I've got 2 today, and my husband also showed up and went, well, I've got 2. Then you have to have this conversation about what are we going to do to make up the other 6?
Yes.
So this ability to start conversations about capacity around needs, around, physical and mental well-being with those people in our kind of immediate spheres that can help those relationships thrive in those difficult times, but also gives you a really simple language to talk about that need ahead of time.
Love that. That keeps it super simple.
Super simple. I've got 2 today. It's all right. I've got 10. We're good. So I sharing that because I found that quite helpful. Okay, so let's not delay into diving into the kind of main body of our conversation today, which I'm really looking forward to, which is specifically how you and your work relates to the field of trauma, mental health and well-being, what it is that you wish people knew or understood or were advocating for. And we'll have lots of different listeners working in many different healing contexts that not everyone will understand your work, or actually integrative medicine, functional medicine as a vehicle for, significant change is an important tool in their kit. So if I could ask you first to start by just saying your name and just a brief explanation of who you are to camera, and then we'll go straight into that conversation.
Sounds good. BG Mancini, and my work is as a neurodevelopmental specialist. I'm someone who does functional medicine, primary care, 30 years experience. I've worked with brain injuries, trauma injuries in the brain, which look very similar, integrative medicine, acupuncture medicine, and sort of the bridging gap between what research shows and what we are experiencing in our daily lives, and how we can connect that so that we can live each moment more comfortably, taking into account, what our sensory experience, including nutrition, neuroception, proprioception, interoception, the feelings that are coming from within us, and how that applies to resolving our past trauma and reducing our current traumas that we're creating in response to our environment.
Great. And then to just help our listeners understand where you've come from, I know that this started for you at a very young age. This was kind of modeled, or at least an understanding of the importance of functional medicine and integrative medicine in this space. Can you just give us a little bit of that background and your journey to what you do now?
Sure. So in a way, I'm 3rd generation. My grandmother, my dad was born in 1923. And so from him, when I was, 5, 6 years old, we were growing sprouts, we were juicing, learning about vitamins that were, all vitamins back then were very, very large. And there was like one multivitamin. And he was teaching us about superfoods, and he understood blue-green algae and how to food combine and bee pollen and things like this. And then his mother, before there were chiropractors, and certainly before, she had never gone to school for it, but she understood the body and how adjusting the bones and the fascia, which she would never have had a word for, but understanding how use somatic and touch work, right, really help to heal the body. And so even though my dad was a businessman at large, he would also stop people on the street and say, if you tried breathing this way, it would really clear up that color in your face. He does. And I know that I get a lot of that from him. And so, that was sort of my history. And then when my niece had a traumatic brain injury at birth and she was told she would never walk or talk, it was a hypoxic double cord wrap. My father found the Institute for the Achievement of Human Potential, which essentially modeled how movement repatterns around injuries in the brain. And when I say injuries, just for the sake of the conversation, injury happens whether it is a concussive, a physical trauma, emotional trauma, chemical injury, right? So anything that's creating ongoing stressors are being evidenced now on functional MRIs to show that the injuries look quite the same. So what we're talking about doing is how do we use movement in this case, right, to navigate around those injuries, create new pathways. So it's working with neuroplasticity, but we didn't know that word back then. And she made a full recovery. So that's kind of my background, and it's tied in with having gone to acupuncture school and worked with Oriental medicine, functional medicine, integrative medicine is just something I've done for the past 30 years. Food as medicine, we were doing experiments with gluten-free and dairy-free and fasting, 30 years ago, and understanding what the results were on chronic illness, on cancer, on individuals' sense of well-being. And what's interesting is connection, how they felt more connected to their food and to each other.
Yeah, I think that's such an important bedrock of all of the work in this space is the importance of connection and community and relationships in the context of health and healing. But I'd just like, for your previous generations in your family, I imagine they were working against that perception of this being very woo-woo and peripheral. But, what we're seeing now is there's more data and more science to back this up. And it's definitely gone from being peripheral to more mainstream. But with that is a challenge around navigating everything that's becoming available. So we've got more mainstream awareness, but it's not always clear in this space to know what to do, even if you do invest, like me, quite a lot of time in understanding and navigating it. So talk to me a little bit about your hopes, your dreams, and maybe some fears around what's happening in this field as as something that's got such potential for health and healing, but also that, I think at the moment is also quite difficult to penetrate in terms of getting to the right information.
It's such a great point. It's really, I keep my head down as far as a lot of the internet noise and all of the new fads and the new trends and everything a bit because it's so overwhelming to me, right? And this is what I eat day in and day out. We were just looking at a couple of new products just before we jumped on our call, and there's so many things out there that, when I talk to people, I say, let's start with one thing, right, that we can just easily work into your life that doesn't feel like a heavy lift to you. I generally call it the 5% rule. If we're going to look at, the brain and gut axis are intrinsically tied to how we feel, how we process trauma being from the, it's not the incident, but how we respond to it. And I want to just note that when I talk about the micro traumas that we are experiencing in real time, it means that you are being impacted, whether you know it or not, subconsciously, unconsciously. You're processing so many bits of information through all of your senses, visually, auditorily, taste, smell, whether you're moving or not with proprioception. And then the interoception are signals that are meant to lovingly guide us. They are also happening in response to those signals. So now, not only are we feeling those signals, but our brain has to make up a story about it. What is that feeling in my gut? Hold on, is that okay? Wait, that happened the last time I ate this food, or that happened when my mom yelled at me, or that happened when, and now it's navigating this story, pulling in all the stress and trauma from those other events that it happened with. So when I talk about, our experience in the body, it's happening from so many different perspectives that we're not aware of, that if we can just take one thing for today, I'm going to be aware of the sounds that are impacting me. Are they impacting me? How about the smells around me? What can I change in my environment that's going to make me less reactive in our bodies? And then that keeps us less reactive to the world because our inflammation goes down and we get more comfortable in our in our home, which is our body.
Yeah, and it just reminds me, like with all of the different modalities and approaches and tools and techniques and research that we look at on this podcast and all the events that we do, there is no single thing that works. There is no silver bullet. It's always a case of having all of these levers at disposal and knowing which one's going to work for a particular individual in a particular moment. And I think that's the challenge with there being so many, lots marketed in a way that presents themselves as the solution, and it's just not that simple. So I guess what might be helpful for some of our audience is if you could explain integrative medicine and its role specifically in the context of trauma, mental health and healing, and how, if you are maybe currently a therapist working with clients who have a little frame of reference to that, how they would build a bridge. You talked about your role being building that connection and that bridge, how they might start to do that and think about think about bringing integrative medicine into their, if just their frame of reference, but potentially then as a toolkit that they can use with clients where it feels appropriate.
So if I may, the last thing that you said just made me think of something, that none of the tools that are discussed out there in the regards to health, healing, mental health, anything will work without taking the nervous system into account, right? So any supplementation, any food diet change, any of these things has to consider the state of the nervous system. And so, the remarkable thing about what therapists do, whether it's somatic therapy, trauma therapy, it's all about that therapeutic relationship and building this connection for the client to have scaffolding in their nervous system is part of that. And then to be able to give them tools. And so when individuals are very detached from their body because they don't feel safe in it, and that happens with any type of trauma, chronic illness, inflammation, autoimmunity, all of these things say by diagnosis, I'm not safe in my body. By feeling, it says, I'm not safe in my body. And so these are constantly, then the therapeutic relationship is getting built in those 1 hour sessions or whenever it is, anchoring and scaffolding and building that, right? But then the rest of the time, they have this dynamic where they're bootstrapping themselves back into safety because they're still getting exposed to things. And so when I teach clinicians, first, of course, identifying for themselves, getting in touch with this language around, and as Bessel van der Kolk is talking about sensory input. Ruth Lanius has a great new book out about sensory and trauma. And so the evidence is really stacking about how do we create more cues of safety. As Steve Porges says, safety is not the absence of threat, and accessing safety in our nervous system is much easier when we reduce the threat input coming in through real time. So to your question, I guess the integrative medicine model, from my perspective, not necessarily what you're going to see on the internet, right? Because integrative medicine was meant to be this advanced field of individualized medicine, root cause, and now has become a little bit more allopathic, where it's, instead of take this medication, take this herb. And that is, I still feel a move in the right direction, but it is not integrating this nervous system capacity, giving autonomy and agency back to individuals so that they're aware of what's happening inside of them in response to the world. And, I had spoken to you about the mind-body blueprint as an example, something that I created to get people in touch with their sensory input, how it's impacting them, and then just taking one of those areas and giving it a little attention during the day. So I would say that just navigating individuals towards consciousness, instead of just, to come back to center, give a couple things that I hear, see, I forget how it goes, and I use that for myself too. But also, how am I responding to that in a moment that's not a crisis, right? Okay, there's a sight and sound. How does that feel to me?
So when you say sensory input, you're just talking about the senses and really tuning into those individualistically, and say, how does what I see or how I smell or how I hear or how I touch, or is that what you talk to us a little bit about how to start that work then? How do you get people to kind of tune into that? Because I think from the conversations we've had, the way you describe that, there's a mindfulness aspect to that. It's becoming aware or mindful about each of those inputs. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just trying to understand if there's a psychotherapist listening now and thinking, okay, well, how? Show me, give me a bridge, give me an example.
Well, I think it's mindfulness meets research on sensory input in this case. and how that impacts, but I want to bring it back to how that impacts the brain and gut axis, the vagus nerve, and the whole system. So just as the example that, I have a lamp over here that I like the lighting on, but the sound has a bit of a hum that over time will start to grate on me. Now, I may not know that that's what's grating on me, but if I sit here long enough, if I don't have the lamp at the right adjustment, eventually my head's going to get a little annoyed, right? And maybe I start to get a little bit more discontent. Now, most people aren't going to think, okay, lamp, but our auditory system and our visual system, even the strain from the flicker of our screens, are creating inflammation and stress in our brains. So there's a great thing you can put it in the show notes. There's this thing you can download for $20 for life, and it reduces the harmful flicker rate and some of the blue light on your screen on the computer. People then tell me that their visual system feels more relaxed. Well, that relaxes the brains, that lessens the metabolic resources of your brain trying to fight through your day. So then maybe you sleep better, which is what I've heard, and people's eyes don't hurt as much. So now we're talking about like a small little change, right? That then cumulative benefits. And the whole thing is that if our nervous system is actually resilient, these things won't impact us as much. But when we are dysregulated, which many of us are living in fight and flight constantly, then all of these things, if we can stack those things up a little bit, okay, we change the screen protector, we protect our ears from the noise, and then maybe our nervous system gets a little more resilient, we get better sleep, our digestion improves, and then we become more resilient to the outside world.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you think there's two kind of factors at play here, and when we had Ron Priambus on the podcast, he was talking about the fact that we could never have adapted, we could never have evolved to adapt to the change that we've seen in the last 50 years. My perspective on this is that there's so many more forces on us now by virtue of the world that we're living in that create that agitation, that disruption to all those signals, all those cues, our food system, the lack of transparency, and we don't really know most of the time what we're consuming. So that ability to feel how, the things that we put in our body makes us feel, or like you say, that ability to kind of, the conscious there, right? It's the noise the light makes that's creating the just sense of unrest or like a lack of ease within the body. So it's, coming back to how we sort of single some of those things out and think about them and navigate them makes sense, because those two things together, the fact that we can't possibly have evolved to live in the world that we do now, there's so many forces on our time and attention, stripping that back and saying, what is it that's creating that dis-ease, that sense of not quite being in that optimal state?
Well, that's super. I love that, what he says, right? Who was it who said that?
Ron Priambus.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look that up. So, but then if you bring that back to what is our sensory input doing in real time to our nervous system, to our gut and brain? So our gut is interpreting the outside world for us at all times. It's responding in real time. So it is then taking this subconscious information and determining threat, not threat, neutral. But then as our nervous system gets more heightened, we are now perceiving unconsciously, subconsciously interpreting neutral and safe as threat to our body. So we are now using a lens of threat to interpret the world, and we are now having internal responses and fear to those sensations and to those processes because they're so foreign to us, because from a very young age we were told, don't feel. And if you do feel something, a child who wakes up in the morning with a stomach ache but is told to get ready for school anyway, but the stomach ache is actually anxiety, or the stomach ache is a stomach ache because they're eating foods that don't agree with them. So when we talk about it is sensory, but it's also this concept of keeping the gut-brain axis and the vagus nerve that connects in between in a optimal state so that literally the boundaries are intact, because this is the start of our digestive tract. It's at our mouth. And it is the only organ that is exposed to the outside world. And it has our enteric brain that lives in it. We won't get too far into that, but it has, where most of our dopamine is made, most of our serotonin. And if our gut is not intact, in fact, it gets leaky, as many people have heard, then our boundary to the outside world is actually being affected, because now it's open, it's porous, and more things go into our body, into the matrix of us, creating inflammation, creating viruses where they don't belong. And the most advanced research now shows that anxiety, depression, addiction, all mental health disorders, including schizophrenia, are very clinically tied to the health of the microbiome.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the fact that that is an exposed organ. But again, some of the rituals in the space of integrative medicine, I mean, there is more and more clinical research about how your oral hygiene dictates your physical health, plaque in the mouth and plaque in the body. I mean, just the more we learn, I mean, it does become increasingly complex to navigate, but the more intuitively that makes sense. You say that is the only organ that is truly exposed in the body. Everything else has a huge amount of protection. And that being such a direct effect on the nervous system. Again, another reference to an experience I had with Louis Nahika, who was talking about how food and patterns of what we have with food can be around nervous system, attempts at nervous system regulation. So I was saying, at the end of a busy day, like reaching for some crunchy snacks and crunching down and swallowing, it's just kind of, it shifted. Sometimes it was just shifting gear from stopping working and starting being a mom, or starting to think about it was like this. I thought it was hunger, but actually I think it was something, it was ritual, it was behavior, it was ingrained behaviors, it was maybe the physical sensation of
sensory, absolutely.
Absolutely a sensory input, did some sort of satiation, but not just around hunger, I realize now, but actually around the nervous system. It was signaling a shift. So, I mean, how do you think, what are your thoughts on the most appropriate way for integrative medicine to be taken to, more of a mainstream? Where do you start with that? Because, I mean, I'm fully convinced after quite a few years now of understanding the trauma field and being deeply personally invested and intrigued by integrative medicine, the case for the tools that are in that world are so applicable for the tools in the trauma field. But, having an integrative practitioner is not accessible for most. So that piece around where to start, where are the quick wins, how do you navigate what is quite complex research and evidence and opportunities to say, this is a good place. And I keep coming back to this, but I'm wanting to equip our audience with the best knowledge and understanding of where to start.
It's a tough question, because that's like saying, what's the one pill I should take? Yeah. However, I write about this quite a bit because I'm constantly reading the research and trying to draw, where are those easy access points for people? And I think number one is just becoming aware of and naming the fact that this is happening, right? Puts more agency back on an individual. Hey, listen, this is not just an experience that you're having, even, using, the body keeps the score, right? We know, yes, there's a somatic holding in the body of our experiences, but let's become aware of the fact that we have this neuroceptive pattern, right? Neuroception, and that lens is being impacted by everything we are taking in, and then creating that autonomic nervous system state. So I would truly say that tuning into how we feel, what's around us that might be impacting us, putting some stop gaps and supports in place. We don't have to do all the things. In fact, when I try and do all the things, cold plunge, do this, do my yoga, all that midday, I end up more stressed, right? But what are the easy things to put in place? Is a pair of blue block glasses at night, if it improves your sleep 5-10%. Can you get outside for 5-10 minutes in the morning, perhaps in the evening, or open a window and just let the skylight hit your eyes within 30 minutes when you wake up? Putting these screen protectors on in order to stop the over metabolic use of our resources in our body. Because if our brain is having to work harder for any particular reason, our digestive resources are declining, our gut resources are declining, right? And so our vagus nerve may become less efficient. And there's also just wonderful somatic tools too, like the Stanley Rosenberg Reset. I'm a huge fan of that. It's a wonderful tool. You can find it on YouTube. It takes a little bit of practice, and I would say lay down when you start doing it. But for those who don't know about it, that I've seen some remarkable results in the moment with that and over long term. So I'm trying to think of other,
I really like what you're saying there, because if you go back to the real basic principles of movement, daylight, food in its most simple format as much as you can, the 80-20 rules, seems relatively easy. And then I find that if I do that, go for walks, be with nature, get daylight, be in community, they give me more capacity then to focus. Yeah, they give me the more capacity then to think about, well, where do I go next? Where do I start to kind of listen or learn some more? So I think, those simple principles that we've lost sight of, because many of us might wake up, maybe not leave the house now. So many people are working from home, maybe not get the daylight, have a regular practice, whether that's mindfulness or meditation or yoga. I think that's yeah. I think that's an interesting place to start, because then it starts to open you up to the possibility of, okay, if I can feel this much better doing those simple things, where else might I kind of go next?
And even, but Emma, wouldn't you say, I mean, I know that for some people, they hear, okay, the idea of a morning ritual and all of that, a little bit triggering. Because they're like, oh my God, I need more, like, I need one more thing to try and get my day going, when they're bootstrapping themselves. So I feel like the wisdom of adding in some things like, more fiber, just some more vegetables. We talked about the microbiome mashup that's called, which scaffolds your entire nervous system by healing your gut. Okay, so that's one thing. And then just changing these things that don't require heavy lifts at all, even if you don't notice the change, it is going to be reducing the metabolic, neurological, emotional resources that your body is processing things all day long. And then resilience starts to build on top of that. So I want to use things that, once you install the screen changer, or once you add in some of these good fiber foods, then those things are just, now let's see where you are, more of a baseline for yourself, for your clients. And that way you're not having to do these whole cycle changes, which will really feel intimidating for my nervous system. I'm sure for others as well.
Talk to the audience about the mashup, because you and I spoke briefly about it earlier, but I think everyone should, yeah, know about that.
It's very easy. Listen, whatever feels right to you, but generally between 25 and 30 vegetables of any kind, even some herbs, whatever, you basically throw it in a food processor, chop it up, freeze it in Ziploc bags, and take a tablespoon up to two is what you want to work up to. But I always say start small, chew well in case you have gut issues. Sometimes a lot of fiber at one time can be challenging, but this is helpful to restore the capacity for the gut to digest. Because for those who don't know, the inside of your intestines and the microbiome, they're going to eat the fibers that come in. That's what they actually live on. And if those fibers that they need are not there, they will start to eat the intestinal lining. And that is what becomes leaky gut and creates inflammation. And those are the things that are tracking to arthritis, anxiety, depression, physical illnesses. So we want to just make sure we're feeding the microbiome. And so you can take those things, you can find this online, grab the kids, take them to the farmer's market. It's a once a month thing. You can make enough. And then have them pick out all the weird stuff you don't even know what it is, learn a new vegetable. It takes about an hour to do, and the results have been significantly improved. Gut function, better mood, and better sleep, better energy. Just for trauma resolution, if we think about someone who's either checked into an inpatient or is going to start some type of therapeutic process, is it easier to do so when their brain is on fire, when their nervous system is on fire, when they're constantly being overstimulated and it's hard to even be present with the therapeutic intervention? Is it easier to start like that, or use tools in integrative medicine, even simple things like the right fish oil, perhaps, which is generally tolerated 90%. Perhaps it's something for the gut, like we've talked about with the microbiome mashup or berberine, or something that reduces inflammation, so that the individual, and this is true with addiction as well, because I've worked with several different addiction facilities, if we can get the individual, just their biology, to be more calmed down, then it makes them more available for that brilliant therapist's work to have more impact. And that's really what the whole purpose is. It's to allow the clinician to have their care and their work shine and be as impactful as possible. And to do that, we need to make individuals available, accessible, their nervous system ready to receive. And part of that is reducing the threat input, the threat response inside the body, and then adding those cues of safety through the connection and community of the therapy. So Dr. Porges talks about vagal efficiency, and he uses several different tools to help make that happen, through the auditory system. Bessel van der Kolk is speaking about, sensory input. And the whole point is, how are these things impacting our vagal function, our vagal efficiency? And that is determining how our digestive process is going to go, which is going to determine how our nutrition uptake is. And if we think in terms of actual whole person health and no longer separating mental and physical health, which of course is, happening more and more now and is the foundation for integrative medicine. It's not meant to be functional medicine. It's supposed to be mind-body medicine. And then if we can think of it that way, we will help individuals. What I find is I can talk to a patient in a way that restores hope inside of them because I've given them back the tools to navigate the ship that they're driving through life, because so much of medicine is taking the power away from them. And I know your audience, who are trauma informed and somatic therapists, are fully aware of this, and that's part of their process. But not knowing what's causing physical, neurological, and emotional symptoms is terrifying. We've all been through it. And then not only is the symptom uncomfortable, but the fear process and the story that our brain makes predictively about what's happening is creating its own sense of trauma and PTSD. So just by giving this information to individuals, it does create a roadmap or a toolbox for them so that they feel that they know how to navigate the day, understanding what's happening inside of them a little better.
And it's not only empowering, it's hope.
It is.
Knowing that all of this is at your disposal offers a huge amount of hope for change if you're not in a great place, because there's so many things that you could exhaust before, there's always hope, but particularly in this space, there's so many things you can do to create more favorable, fertile ground for health or healing. BG, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.